We just like politics itself. One thing is because it's easy. It has a low bar of entry. All you have to be is sort of full of baloney and shake a lot of hands.
74 years old, Patrick Jake PJ ORourke died this morning at his New Hampshire farm of the cancer he had been battling for a number of years. PJ has appeared a number of times on this program on Uncommon Knowledge, and in a moment, a few clips of those appearances. First, a brief remembrance of our friend PJ with Rob Long. PJ, I should say, began, as Rob well knows, as a hippie, began his career in journalism on the left. During the 1970s, he underwent some kind of transformation and moved to the right. He wrote for National Lampoon, Vanity Fair, probably most famously for Rolling Stone. PJ produced 16 books, including what is, in my judgment, still the best book ever written on Washington, 1991, Parliament of Whores. Rob, place PJ first as a journalist and writer.
Well, I mean, I think he went through a couple phases. He went through the journalism phase, where he traveled. His great book, Holidays in Hell,
Yes,
spectacular travel series of travel logs, kind of Evelyn Waugh style, but with a distinctly American voice. He took a great cruise. In the old days, it wasn't just National Review and conservative magazines that had cruises. The Nation had a cruise, apparently, and they went down the Volga or some Soviet river. He was surrounded by American communists who insisted on admiring all the concrete and the chemical plants and things. So he was a travel writer. Before, I think he started writing more specifically about the American government and the way and American culture. And all of those essays he wrote, all the travel logs, all the investigations really that he made, and including one very moving one he made into his own family finances growing up. They all were like incredibly American. There's somewhere between Mark Twain and Will Rogers and Evelyn Waugh and the great travel writers of British travel writers between the wars.
We invented the idea that liberty could be organized so that a government served a free people. And at the time that Lincoln was fighting the Civil War, we were the only country in the world that could be, of which that could be remotely said. Although the British had a lot of liberties, or I should say the English had a lot of liberties, and some Welsh maybe, or something, a few lowland Scots. Although they had a lot of liberty, they were still subjects. In America, the government was subject to we the people.
It's important to note, I think, this is an important piece of the story, that PJ was at the top of the magazine world.
Yeah.
When magazines still valued prose. When you'd still go to Esquire and Rolling Stone to read these magazines. Also, I suppose, this wasn't a point I was going to make, but also when the magazines had unbelievably lavish expense accounts. So you could, I want to go to the Volga, go, done, send in your receipts. And what receipts you don't have, make them up. And then it was a glamorous world to be a top magazine. There was a glamour about PJ, I always felt. So this comes into the question of friendship. I got to meet him back during the 80s when I was a kid speechwriter in the White House. PJ is just half a generation older than the two of us. And I had a government job, and my friends in Washington, Andy Ferguson was writing for intellectual magazines, conservative magazines.
Right.
And there was PJ ORourke, this glamorous figure who was writing for Rolling Stone for the whole country. He was spectacular. How did you meet him?
I think I met him in Los Angeles. Wow, this must have been the early 90s, probably 1991, 1990. And he came out for something, probably a book tour, and we had mutual friends. And so we sort of became friends then. And it was harder to be friends with somebody back then. People forget you just didn't send people emails and you didn't follow them on Instagram. If you wanted to talk to PJ ORourke, you had to type out a letter or hope that you would bump into him at a party. And so we exchanged stuff back and forth. And for like 10 seconds, we were trying to turn Holidays in Hell into a TV series.
Oh, really?
Which would have been great, by the way. Still would be great, by the way. And then I didn't see him again, or I didn't really see him in person again until years later when we both appeared in a series of books put out by Templeton Press, the Seven Deadly Virtues, the Seven Christmas Virtues, the Seven Dadly Virtues, I think. And he was one of the contributors, and so we sort of rekindled our friendship then. But you're right. The magazine world in the 70s when he started, it was incredibly lavish. He could just say to Jan Wenner, who ran Rolling Stone at the time, I would like to go to Beirut and I want to spend a month there. And I think I'll be in the hotel where all the other reporters are. And the answer to that was, of course, yes. And I did forget one other part of his sort of hippie parallel writing career. He was a writer for National Lampoon.
That's right.
And then wrote on a hippie magazine in the 60s and lived in some commune shack in Baltimore, which he wrote about and also talked about. It was just fantastic. But he had sort of a humorist too, not just a journalist, but a humorist. He put together some great humor. I was just talking to on Twitter, Iowa Hawk, who's the great humorist on Twitter, about the funny things that PJ ORourke did before he sort of exploded on the scene. He and it might have been John Hughes, the director, John Hughes, worked together on a thing called the National Lampoon Sunday newspaper parody. And they printed up a thing that was looked like a Sunday newspaper for some town in Ohio. And it was I forget the name of the town, but it was the Republican Democrat was the name of the newspaper. It is the most specifically hilarious, laugh out loud, funny parody of small town journalism in general. It's really a masterpiece, but it's an object too. Like you read it like a newspaper.
One really unpleasant thing about self-absorption as you get older is who and what you're absorbed in. When one was young and trim and fit and so on, it was one thing to be self-absorbed. To be self-absorbed in an old and flabby, not very well and somewhat forgetful person is really, and that's hence the pandemic. Every generation gets this is our crisis here. This is our depression. This is our World War II. Every generation gets the crisis it deserves. But the one thing crisis is supposed to do is bring people together. We got a crisis that keeps people 6 feet apart.
Rob, we've been friends for years and years and years, and I've never asked this question point blank, but it's important to ask when trying to assess PJ's achievement. How hard is it to be funny in print?
It's hard to be funny. I tell you what, it's hard to be funny when no one's paying you. And that it really is true. Like there's a certain journeyman quality to what PJ did. He was a brilliant writer, but he also was kind of like getting an assignment or coming up with one on his own and keeping track of his expenses and writing the truth. It's very hard. In fact, it's impossible to be funny unless you're telling the truth. And I think when you read Parliament of Horrors, which is really kind of a masterpiece of political writing.
I agree.
There's a section, and I just mentioned it, but I really think people should reread, where he goes through the receipts. He wants to know what happened to his family when he's growing up.
Right.
And he goes through the receipts, the box of financial stuff that his mom had saved, and he realized how poor they were, how close they came to losing the house, to like not being able to afford groceries, just how tight it was growing up.
Toledo, Ohio was his hometown.
And he says, the one thing we really didn't have, we eventually had food on the table. I had parents. What they didn't, and this is why he attributed to why they got through it. What they didn't have was help. That's the one thing they were spared, was government help. They clearly qualified for it and they didn't take it. They didn't have it. And it was really a powerful, so not a conservative policy position or a conservative conclusion. It was a deeply felt American journey. He had been through it. And I think that kind of integrity or the truth telling kind of informed everything he did. You knew what he was writing was true. And that is usually the funniest stuff.
is there an element almost of a Greek tragedy here? Our parents suffer and struggle to give us this perfect world, and we take it and rip it apart.
No, actually, I don't think so. I think that what happened was that our parents came through the Depression and the war and various other things that were going on, themselves deeply disillusioned. You can't have gone through the first half of the 20th century and not have been at least a little disillusioned about organized religion and maybe even the nature of God. They weren't ready to express this publicly, but they had to be. Some very dark books come out of the Greatest Generation. Catch-22 on the funny side, Naked and the Dead on the not so funny side. There was a lot of anxiety in our parents, Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, that kind of thing. And what we were able to do, because of the stability of society and the wealth of society and the permissiveness of our parents, we were able to act out a lot of things that they felt. And some of the things they felt were subconscious, and they were pretty disturbed when we began acting them out. And also, one of the great reasons for dinner table fights and screaming matches during the 60s was that there's nothing more frustrating than watching somebody do and say the kind of things you've wanted to do and say, but haven't had the opportunity or maybe the nerve to do and say. Really infuriating.
We're talking about somebody who sort of burst up on the scene in the 70s.
Yeah.
I got to know him during the 80s. He's a magazine writer. And then in the last 10 years, he retires to a farm in New Hampshire and raises 3 kids with his lovely wife. And he's still writing, but he's not on the scene in the way that he was. So what do you say to kids who love good writing, to kids who are thinking about journalism? What needs to be remembered? What do they need to know about the man we lost today?
I think for him, one of the reasons he was so inspiring was he did interesting things, he went interesting places, and he wrote about it. And I think there's a lot of ways you can complicate that formula. But if you do all those things and you write truthfully, with great humor, but truthfully, what else do you want as a writer? What else do you want? I mean, I don't know a writer sort of my generation who does what I do, who didn't think that he had done it all.
Right.
If I had written what he'd written, I'd be in a farm in New Hampshire and I wouldn't lift a finger to write another word.
We have to learn to limit government, not because of some ideological reason, but simply you can't task the government with everything and expect everything to be well done. It would be like tasking one's wife with both raising the kids and making a living and cleaning the house and doing all the carpooling and while you sat on the couch and drank beer.
You sound like a man who's tried.
Oh gosh, yes. With some success, I may say. But nonetheless, it has its limits.
It has its limits.
Yeah, sooner or later she's going to hit you with a piece of firewood.
Rob, thank you. Rob Long on PJ ORourke, 1947 to 2022. For Uncommon Knowledge, I'm Peter Robinson.